Suffering is a pain that lasts. It compounds. It generates trauma. It stays with us. It makes us fearful. It makes us scared. It separates us from who we are and who we want to be and the consideration of our own freedom. We believe that the deprivation of freedom in hell is the utmost insane pain that is inflicted onto people that have already endured pain all their lives by even existing. We have an obligation to those in hell. I'm going to do two things in the speech. First, I'm going to characterize what are the reasonable characterizations by what this debate looks like. And then second, I'm going to say why hell is likely to be more likely overwhelming with people and it'll likely be overpopulated as a consequence. You have an obligation to them. And lastly, I'm going to explain why the prevention of suffering is the most important good in this debate. One, what is a reasonable characterization of this debate? The first part is, what is a reasonable characterization of a heaven with less resources, with more reallocations? So it's a few things. One, it's likely going to have less grandeur, less lush leaves, but it will still likely be peaceful with a genuine, quiet existence. People will still likely have to work and will still have to probably endure certain discomforts. Why is this important? Grandeur is not important to the soul because having grand things, events, ways to celebrate. These are things that we probably were already exposed to some extent in the world, and we understand that most individuals that die, especially old people, understand and realize that the deprivation or the peaks of happiness and the peaks of sadness are not the most important things we seek for in life. We often seek for stability, the closeness to our relationships, the proximity with other individuals, which is why happiness in itself is not important. It is the happiness of freedom that ties ourselves with other individuals, even in struggle. Two, it is very likely not going to be as comfortable. Maybe our beds are not that nice. Maybe it's very likely we're going to have to go to a hostel every now and then. The extent to which we believe this is important is because we say that discomfort, struggle, in itself is not that valuable for individuals. Actually, I even argue it's good. Struggle is good for individuals. It gives us meaning. When you work for food, which is what might happen in heaven if we don't, fund chefs there, then it's very likely that those individuals will probably find other ways to generate meaning because they know that they are in a quiet, bored place where they could find other ways to connect with other individuals. Like when we're bored, we seek for everything to do. We find a new hobby. We try and discover things. And yes, it might be saturating, but the extent to which we believe this is important is something we're familiar with. And that's why it's okay. In contrast, suffering in hell is something that people never imagine on a day-to-day basis. It is completely irreparable. It is something that is disproportionate. This is for a few reasons. One, previously divine punishment likely looks like that you are in prison. You are in social isolation from other individuals. You're made to repent. You're made to experience your reminder of your trauma every single day in a way that compounds to you. We don't experience that in everyday life. The direct labor for things that you are not rewarded for or compensated for is not unique to us. Maybe prisoners might feel it, but not even prisoners feel it all the time. In a day-to-day basis, for hours and hours on day, this is surveillance at its worst. Our model improves rehabilitation programs to the extent that it fixes the biggest problem in hell right now. When suffering is so deplete and so replete all the time and overwhelming, more people would likely lose hope. More people will likely feel helplessness to the extent that it's disproportionate, which makes them not even want to consider going to heaven or rehabilitating at all. Rehabilitation is probably very difficult in hell. We understand that. It means you're probably going to have to work and endure for a very, very long time. But that is familiar to individuals if we improve rehabilitative programs. Number two, under conditions of violence, when it is done under conditions of violence, the threat of such, like, a guard watching you, punishing you every time you don't do the right thing when you're, shoveling the rocks in hell, for example, we believe we make rehabilitative programs more efficient, more rigorous-based, more evidence-based, more ways to analyze your progress and be able to understand whether or not you're actually improving, more ways to generate our understanding whether or not you have met the requirement to go to heaven. We believe this is actually a good net positive because it allows individuals to also get some degree of the prevention of suffering to the degree that they can go to heaven.
If you're putting more money into health, you also allow it to deter people more. Insofar as the mechanisms for deterrence are the pain that you're talking about, you inflict more pain onto these.
So the deterrence argument for people who are not in hell and heaven, we believe that to the extent that people don't really know what heaven and hell actually is like, we should return to how the world actually is. My argument right now is going to explain more people end up going to hell anyways, regardless of whether or not they anticipate heaven and hell. And this is for a few reasons. One, because the temptations exist in the hyper-real world, hyper-commercialization, gratification. People are disproportionate to the extent in which they have to, override their own impulses because of the tendency for instant gratification. 2, because they're relatively selfish. It's innate to our biology that we prioritize our own feelings and our own self, but also because we compare ourselves against other individuals because we're not personally happy, which leads us to an empathy gap with other individuals. 3, because of inequality with respect to the social institutions which we're likely complicit with, which also generate evil, such as purchasing from other products that likely are exploitative or lead to exploitation to other individuals. Our privilege in itself is complicity and evil to the extent in which we also do not understand what the good is. Number 4, we believe it's also with respect to the fact of lack of discernment and the uncertainty with respect to what God's will is. Most individuals, in their process of finding out what good is, they have to undergo severe suffering, but also severe process in which they have to do bad things as well to understand what good things are, which is why it is more likely that they have less opportunities to be able to repent and rehabilitate themselves while they're in the earth, because when they age, they become less physically able. They're less able to reflect upon their own actions. The more and more faster the time goes by, the more that they end up working for a certain institution, the less and less they're able to opt out of those institutions. We have less consent to the things that we do. Or even the last thing, if we actually do bad things out of the reasons that we believe that it is important for our own welfare. Sometimes we have to do bad things to the extent in which maybe in the net good of the world, it will necessarily be bad for us in heaven and hell, but for our circumstances, it is not important. Throughout one's life, people still end up in hell, which is why our most obligation are to individuals who end up in hell and suffer in ways in which they do not consent. And this is for a few reasons why this is important and the most important principle. Note this principle is independent of the deterrence argument, which they'll do, and maybe they'll win that issue, but this is more important because these individuals did not consent. 1, life itself is suffering. People did not consent to the process in which their circumstances created them or allowed them to facilitate actions that they otherwise could not do. They can't be reasonable and say, no, people could do good things in the world. It's very likely that they cannot do so, which is why we have a reparative, unique obligation to them to at least make suffering less likely, or at least, if not, help them rehabilitate and now make good amends so that they could go to heaven faster. 2, because we believe suffering is remembered and severely done so in a way that limits your freedom. My hopelessness argument is quite important here, because once you feel pain, once you feel suffering in a way that compounds, you lose your sense of identity. You lose your sense of belief that I am a good person. In the world, we likely believe we're all good people. We try to believe that. But when you're in hell, you definitely believe you're bad. For these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Cool. I thank the Prime Minister inviting the leader of all whenever you're ready.
Turning it on.
Okay, my personal pronouns are she, her. If you have any POIs, please raise your hand or stand up. Okay. Sorry, my speech. In 3, 2, 1. First off, talking about what this world is going to look like, right? They basically say heaven is going to be less grand. Sure, we agree with this. Life is probably going to be less uncomfortable. Less comfortable, right? Because you're taking away a lot of things. You're taking away a significant amount of resources that you used to put into heaven. This means that I think it's simply what this is actually going to look like. It's going to be much more similar to life on earth, right? You're probably going to have to work. You're probably feeling lots of discomforts that you didn't think you would experience if you have to go to heaven. Their point was that it's not important because you're dead. But then the problem here is that the deterrence point, right? If you're on Earth, you see, like, as a poor person living on Earth, when you see, like, less grandiose heaven, like, you see, like, a less objective, like, amount of, like, happiness that you would get going to heaven, right? As a person, I don't think you would feel, like, less grandeur, oh, heaven is, like, still important to me. I don't think that was, like, sort of logical thinking that you're going to have. Rather, you're going to consider heaven as something that's, like, less important, or, like, less nice place to go to, and those sort of things. So deterrence point doesn't really work. But then their point about, like, how they're going to, like, they say that more suffering for people who have already committed crimes is bad, or like more rehabilitation for these people is good. But at the point where they say, oh, they're going to put more more things into like making hell even worse to make suffering even bigger. That's the point where these people continue to suffer, right? They're completely contradicting their point. We say that it's not like very clear. But then I want to talk about why simply our side of the house is much better. We say that number one, like on our side of the house, like people are going to have more incentivized to do good. We say that this is something that's very, very important at the end of the day, simply because like even if less people do bad things, if many people do less good, like that means that at the end of the day, your budget is determined by like how many people do good versus how many people do bad. This means that if the number of people who do bad things are more than good, at the end of the day, your budget is going to be much smaller, and at the end of the day, that means you simply have less resources to improve or maintain the very system that they try to support. So we're going to be proving this case. So why is like less people are going to be doing good? I think it's simply true because of the lack of exclusivity that's going to exist on their side of the house, right? I think this is very, very clear because I think like the first point here being that, okay, even though like heaven might be like you're going to have some sort of rehabilitation, or like you're going to have, like, be able to like some sort of improvement or those sort of things. Like the point comes is like if in order to good, and very often in many cases, like doing good things come at the expense of like sacrifice on your behalf, right? For example, if you're trying to help a grandma across the road, you probably have to spend your time, you have to probably spend your energy that you could have spent on other sort of things, or it could come at leaving a bigger sacrifice. If you're going to donate, you're taking a huge portion out of your own finances in order to support other people. At the point where like heaven loses its exclusivity, right? Because I think as a normal person, seeing how heaven has actually turned out through these like lenses, like I think like you would feel that heaven seems much less appealing, right? Because even if you go to heaven, you can't like experience like grandeurs. You're not going to be able to live in like a really nice place. Like it's not going to be any different from your life as it is now. You're still going to have to labor. You're still going to have some sort of boss above you. You're still going to have like this is like it's not as if you're going to be able to afford rich food or like those sort of things. Like none of it is going to be like that simply appealing. When that gap is much smaller, at the point that's the point where you feel like that trade-off, like that sacrifice is not something that is like beneficial for you, right? But then the second thing that we say here is that it's the important thing here is that people contrast it to their own lives, right? I think at that point, like any sort of hope that you see, the level of happiness that you feel that you're going to get from going to heaven is going to be significantly smaller, right? Sure, it might be like maybe 5% better, or maybe I have to like wake up less early, or like maybe those sort of things. But like it's going to be significantly less. We say that that's the point where people do less good in this world, and that's the point where the budget becomes significantly smaller, right? But why is it simply better on our side of the house, and how do we solve it? Because I think at the end of the day, on our side of the house, where the budget still remains high for heaven, I think even if you say, oh, people are saturated, like you're going to feel less happiness, I feel like people on the ground don't really see that, right? As a poor person when you're laboring, when you see like a heaven and you see like the people like how you're just doing this glamorous stuff, like eating nice food, like just lounging on the bench, like doing absolutely no labor and like just being simply rich, I think that's the point where you feel like heaven is something that is good. That's the point where you actually feel incentivized to do good acts, like help poor people, donate, or like you just simply just have more community, like those sort of things, right? I think that's like the very perspective, like these normal people are something that's very, very important. But then the second thing that we say here is that on our side of the house, like things are going to be more socially propagated, right? What I mean by this is like people on earth are probably going to say things like, oh, don't you want to go to heaven? Heaven is such a nice place, or like those sort of things. And when you're able to like actually see exactly how big of a difference there is from your own life and what you're going to get in heaven, like when the difference is very, very clear, that is the point where people are actually opting to these sort of things, right? Even if we say that like hell might deter a little bit more on our side of the house. It's not true that there's going to be zero deterrence on our side of the house, right? Insofar as I think that deterrence exists in the fact that you're going to get a much better life than you have by going to heaven is like something that is very, very important. But then the reason why we say that on their side of the house it's something that is bad, because I think at the point where you say like the allocation is going to be significantly better, more sent to hell, it's probably, I think the perspective of people on earth is going to change significantly, right? When the reason why you commit a crime, right? I think like it's like in our society, like there's like certain points where you're like pushed to do crime. Like for example, like I think you like pushed to do like sin or whatever. And the reason for this being that I think it's simply much easier to do even if that like what you're doing is worse. For example, capitalism, like you're forcing your workers to labor for you, but by doing so you get money and benefits. It's simply much easier than like trying to like be more nicer to people with those sort of things. But then the second thing I want to say here is that there's also arbitrary reasons, right? Lots of people do things like racial things or like those sort of things. Those are also sin in itself. But then I think the point of like on their side of the house is simply when they see that hell is a place that even if you do go to hell, hell, like the system is very nice. Like you might have to labor, yes, you might have to go to hell first, but eventually, because the rehabilitation process is so much more efficient, and it just means that at the end of the day, even if God doesn't send you straight to heaven, it means you still have a very clear path, right? I think the perspective from like a criminal or like someone who's committing a sin on earth is that, okay, I'm going to steal from this shop. Yes, I might go to hell, but eventually, because like if the rehabilitation system is something that is so good, I am going to be able to like go to heaven at the very end. And the reason for this is because I think when you are when you're about to commit a crime, like you're just looking for any sort of solace in doing it, right? When you see that hell is not such a bad place, or like when you see that hell is eventually, even if it's a bad, but you eventually lead to better outcomes for yourself. That's the point where you feel like where this like acts of yourself is more rationalized and like it steers you to do like more less and those sort of things. I think at the end of the day, like I think these people who are looking for confirmation, like what of their outlet, like they're trying to see like whether the outcome is actually good or bad. When they see that the eventual outcome is more likely to be good because the system is so much better, I think that's the point where they opt into these sort of things. I think like simply the clear impact that we bring is that like there's going to be like more bad in their world compared to good, right? And simply this is because, as I've already told you, like there's going to be people who do less good in this world, right? When you realize that you're not going to get as much rewards at the very end, like but it takes a lot of sacrifice for you to do good in this world. That's the point where you feel that like there's clearly less incentives for individuals to do good. At that point where there's a 50-50 ratio and where there's going to be a clear drop in the budget, right? This means like God at the end of the day, even if they have these sort of hell, even if they at first decide to distribute more to hell, it's going to become like an eventual situation where they're unable to put the same amount of resources into hell, which means at the very end of the day, the budget is something that's really important because without that budget or like without that large amount of budget, you're unable to uphold the system or continue what is going on. So even if like the church is like effective in the first place, it's very, very clear at the end of the day that like it's going to be like a short-term thing. At the long term, we actually have much better benefits and leads to more deterrence. Overall, I think our side is actually able to like continue the system of hell in heaven. Very proud to oppose.
Cool. I think we default DPM maneuverability.
First thing to characterize how the heaven looks like, because I think the opposition sides try to argue like this heaven is like very, very bad place. I mean, like it's similar to the current world, but I think this characterization is unlikely. The first reason for this is I think that even though it is significant extent, I don't think it's like it doesn't necessarily mean that make heaven worse, like make heaven very bad. I think the likely scenario is that likely scenario is firstly God have the incentive to still sound good because they want to give the incentive for the sinner to rehabilitate. They want to make people to do good thing in the current world, stuff like that. So I think that these incentives do exist. So I think that it's unlikely to have the very similar world to the current world or the world situation to the current world. I think the scenario characterization coming from them is unlikely. But I think that even if they claim on the same as current world is like true, I don't think this is gonna be. I think that people are still doing some good thing or try to do something good thing because they want to avoid the worst option. Obviously, obviously hell is hell. It's getting easier. For example, like punishment or rehabilitation program exists. That's why I think that people try to avoid the worst option. I think that it is natural. Then how the world of the heaven in our parent looks like is that even though this is not the very highest level of satisfaction, highest level of happiness, still I think you're likely to be happy. You're able to send a peaceful life. This looks like spending peaceful time with your family, going to a cafe and chat with friends, weather is nice, good food is good, stuff like that. I think these are the likely characterization that we want to posit against how the heaven looks like. Then having said said that, the first thing I want to prove is that why the people's moral behavior is unlikely to be changed that much in their cellular paradigm. Because I think that, that they try to argue like people suddenly stop doing good thing in their cellular paradigm just because like, hell, heaven is not perfect. I think in reality, what we want to suggest is firstly, I think that people are likely to do good thing based on their conscience or based on their belief. I think this is likely that they want to avoid the bad things, they want to follow their belief. That's why I think this is not tipping point to change their behavior in an immoral way. Then, but I think that this characterization is not contradict to what we already posit, like why people are likely to go to like bad behavior, like why people are likely to go hell. Because I think the way we try to argue is not only about like people doing bad things, people intentionally do bad things, but people necessarily be in the bad behavior. Probably they have to fit into the bad behavior. Probably they don't know the metric of what is a good or bad, how to be decided to allocate for the heaven or hell. That's the reason why I think people have people are likely to try to be a moral people, but I think that there is instances that people are in the more immoral behavior or people aren't able to be moral in some instances. Yes.
That's a good point. So where do people have more incentive to find out what's good and bad?
Even if they try to find like a good thing, I don't think it is difficult for them to figure out which is a metric of the good and bad to like allocate to the heaven or hell. Or like more importantly, I think it is difficult for people to, incapacity wise to be a good person in the very first place. So what we want to say here is firstly, why we have the less obligation to privilege people who can do good than the people who cannot do good in our cellular paradigm. The people go to hell. The first reason why is the human tendency. We already gave several reasons why people likely to commit some bad behavior in their lives, which have the less opportunity to reparate, which basically means that they are likely to go to, these people are some kind of have the likelihood of going to hell. But secondly, I think the reason why we have to prioritize the people in hell is because I think the suffering or the degree of an impact is very significantly different. Because I think we already told you the suffering is something very severe. This is double, divine punishment is a certain evil because it is double jeopardy. This person are necessarily need to be punished in current world. For example, they are in poverty. For example, they are in poverty, and they are also punished in hell. I think this is the double jeopardy that we have to avoid. Then I think the comparative when talking about how hell, they are able to having a peaceful life, that it is saturated in happiness, etc. It's like significantly less in impact, significantly less in how it directly affected the individual, as we already explained. That's the reason why I think there is difference in the extent or difference in the degree of an impact affected to the people. But thirdly, I think more importantly, you cannot assume the people's nature or humans' nature, because I think the people in heaven, moral people, are moral because they are privileged enough to care about us, privileged enough to self-sufficient. In absence of this privilege, they might not to be moral. Environment, because I think the environment shapes our people a lot. For example, people who get bullied might not trust people who got abuse might learn communication through violence. People in slum might involve in gang activities. That's the reason why I think the environment shapes the people's personality. Environment shapes whether or not people can be moral person or evil person. That's the reason why I think these will not, and I think it's intuitive that these kind of things will not happen if you are surrounded by peaceful relationship, if you have the capacity to be a good person. In that instance, that's why even if it seems to be moral and immoral, it's not actually the case. Well, what you have to suggest is that it is difficult to determine the nature of the people, and oftentimes the people personality or people's behavior are characterized by the environment. That's the reason why everyone deserves the redemption and everyone deserves to less suffering. That's the principle we want to suggest. And even though they try to argue probably like people enjoy less enjoyment and less happiness, and probably the small number of people will do less good thing, I don't care, because I think these kind of like people who are in the bad environment, people who necessarily have to be evil, people who don't have the capacity to do good because of the environment, is something we have to prioritize. That's something we have to care about. That's the reason why we already told you how the caring about the suffering is very, 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 very important in relation to their impact. But because I think we already told you like how their impact is not substantiated well, I don't think that they're able to suggest why this small decrease, some level of decrease of the decrease in happiness is significant tipping point for people to change behavior in the very first place. Well, we already told you that this allocation of the resources can be the tipping point to prepare for the situation that they can rehabilitate. They're able to give the hope that they can be rehabilitated and go to the heaven. Even though they are able to give the slight likelihood of happening, we have to prioritize this impact. It's going to be likely to happen more. It is likely to be impacted more compared to the opposition side paradigm. That's the reason why we already told you how that all of these we already explained how their impact is very, very marginal. We suggest that everyone deserves the redemption.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of Rehabilitative.
All right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The info slide clearly suggests the fact that the reason our world's hell isn't doing super well is, firstly, it's not able to rehabilitate people very well, but secondly, it can deter people very well. And insofar as the characterization of deterrence is all of the pain, is all of the suffering that they want less of, then a hell that does better deterrence also harms people a lot more, also has much more brutal depictions of violence against people of hell, so that the people of earth can understand not to want to go to hell, right? So if that is the characterization that the info slide makes very clear from the get-go, then you guys cannot go away by just saying that, oh, we want less punishment for these people because rehabilitation. Yes, but rehabilitation comes at a big cost, which is the instrumental use of those inhabitants as objects to inflict harm upon, to show as examples to the people of earth. This is something they don't contest with. And so, if their whole idea is about let's not inflict more harm, but then they're funding the mechanisms of harm to perpetuate a lot more harm, then in that sense, they're kind of beating up their own case, right? The other aspect of their case that their entire case is dependent upon is this idea that a lot of the people that are morally good don't deserve, or rather didn't deserve to be in that place, right? They were privileged, but also the people that are morally bad didn't deserve to be there, right? It's a problem of circumstance, right? The crucial assumption here is that God is a human, is that whatever the perception of a person is their direct morality, when there's no reason to believe so, right? So if we're talking about heaven and hell, then the arbiter of who goes where is God. God is everywhere, God is all-knowing, and God is doing all these things all the time, right? If this is true, and there's nothing else in the info slide, then it also must be true that God knows about the circumstances. God knows about, how you're forced to do something bad. And most religions all around the world take this stuff into account, right? Hey, you didn't have the intention. Hey, you were forced to do this stuff. I can eat haram if I'm under circumstance, right? Even though I'm Muslim. The point is simply the fact that if the arbiter of justice is someone who is omnipotent and omniscient, then therefore you can't say that the immoral people are actually moral and the flip, right? If that isn't true, then when they say that, oh, the moral people don't deserve better things because they were privileged, well, the problem is, even if you're privileged, you can still do things like corruption. You can still exploit other people that are working at your factory. You still have the principle of strength upon you, the fact that you have more agency than other people, and therefore you have more obligation to serve those other people, again, perpetrated by religions, right? If that is then true, then it must be the case that if someone goes to heaven, then they actually did deserve it. That regardless of their status of privilege, their judgment was probably in respect to that status, in respect to their conditions. Insofar as that is probably the case, as far as God is all of these things, then it becomes very weird on their end, right? Two things I'll be then proving. Firstly then, why a crueler hell, which is unique to their side, is just simply immoral. Firstly, just simply what they are already saying, right? That most people are forced to do bad things and, they feel harm on earth and that's just bad anyways, right? Let's say that's true and everything I've said so far is just false, right? Why then is hell just certainly crueler on their end? Firstly, because rehabilitation does not equal to deterrence. I don't think anyone's deterred by rehab. So then the obvious logical truth must be the deterrence in the info slide must refer to the fear of deterrence, right? The fear shown, displayed to the people on earth in order to deter people on earth from doing bad things, right? So that means that hell must be crueler. There must be more instruments of worse harm, of deeper harm, of more explicit harm upon the people of hell. Why then do we think this is a disproportionate punishment, compounding on their case, right? 3 reasons. One, because again, let's say if they're true, then maybe a lot of people really didn't choose to do bad things, or maybe at the start they didn't, but they just kind of caught onto it. They got like socially, pressured into doing so, right? But secondly, because the harm on earth already serves as an amount of punishment, right? So it's unclear why you need so much more punishment upon these people. Most importantly,
any extra harm that they add on their side is one that is inherently instrumental, insofar as it's only harm implemented upon them, not just because they did something bad, but to make a display out of them, right? It is literally group punishment just to make a show out of a certain group of people, not even just to serve as a punishment. We think this is immoral because this has nothing to do with how they were or what kind of person they were, rather just to make an example out of them to other people, thereby using them as a means to an end, right? Then, how do we weigh this against the better rehab after I'll take you? The reason this is more important than the better rehab, so that's how they're going to weigh against this, is 3 reasons. Firstly, because the harm inflicted upon these inhabitants stays forever. So even if you get rehab and end up in heaven where you're going to work anyways, it's not the great heaven anyways, you're still harmed, you're still traumatized. All the bullets inside you, everything that's happened to you stays with you. The memories stay, right? Secondly, it does not cancel out the harm either, right? It doesn't just go away and therefore, again, you have to contend with the feelings that you had to go through. Thirdly, the end goal, like I said, is no better than earth, or maybe just a little bit better, right? They want to say that, oh, heaven is still a little bit better, but a little bit better than the literal sucky earth that they themselves characterize, right? So if they tell you that earth is a horrible place, then a little less horrible is still kind of bad, right? It's still not exactly nice, right? So at the end of the day, you're inflicting huge amounts of harm onto people that don't deserve that much harm, and then allowing them to go to what was basically already not very great, right? At that point then, making hell crueler than it already is inherently immoral. But then, on our side, 2 things. All right, go.
So, most people reasonably believe that they're also deeply flawed in ways that they cannot change, even if they tried their best in their entire life. Isn't it worse to see people continue to fail and stay in hell in your world?
The reason it's not worse is because the harm that they're going through is in of itself lesser, but to a degree, they deserve an amount of harm because we tell you that the only way, the judgment vector of getting to hell is one that is inherently something that is non-human, right? Something that is much more considerate than we can be, right? Therefore, only if you are immoral, you deserve some amount of harm, but the degree of harm cannot be exceeding a certain limit, right? Insofar as they go far beyond this amount of harm for eventually getting to a benefit that really doesn't exist, probably not true. But more importantly, the way we also deal with that is by proving that more people just simply do good and more people therefore have more access to heaven. 3 reasons. Firstly, because inherently it's just hard to do good things for all the reasons they said, right? How do you find the resources? And it's also just in general kind of hard to do. It comes at your own expense sometimes, your time, etc. But then secondly, because it's uniquely on our end that heaven is exclusive, right? It's not very many people that you see end up, what's the word? It's much, like the barrier is kind of higher to go to heaven, and therefore you see it as something that's a social phenomenon to kind of latch onto, right? But thirdly, the perception of it is still good, right? They can talk about how no one cares about material benefits, but when you're looking from earth to somewhere where you don't have material benefits to somewhere where you do, even if you can rationalize into that doesn't matter, from the point at which you are, it's hard to make this rationalization. Maybe in the edge cases of some old people, sure, but for the vast majority of us, the reason we're capitalists is because we are all materialists, right? So at that point then, why is it more important to reward than the worst punishment? Firstly, this reward is far more important, even if we're getting more people in hell, because this is a real course for the suffering they went through in earth, right? Because they made sacrifices, because the delta of suffering here is far greater on people on earth who didn't deserve it at all. They did absolutely nothing wrong compared to the people who are going to hell, who at some point, at some extent, did consent to it. And therefore, in terms of consent, in terms of deservedness, you ought to benefit more than you do punish. For those reasons, all.
Cool. I think the dialogue got food went away already.
The biggest thing that opposition didn't prove within this debate is why it's going to be so easy for you to do good in the first place on their side of the house. We've already given you many layers of analysis as to why being able to be a good person and go to heaven in the first place is almost unreachable and unrealistic as a goal. Therefore, your ability to actually receive and have the solace, no matter how well of a reputation heaven will have, is still not going to be very realistic. That is to say that the improvement and the impacts, the positive impacts that they give you in this debate is truly not going to be as accessible as they make it out to be. Other than that, we think that the ability for you to receive solace in heaven should not be based on, for example, what your circumstances were during life, which is very much the case, as I'll explain later, and as we've repeated down the bench, because it is way harder for you to do good things and be a good person, especially when the circumstances are going against you, where you perhaps have to be selfish or you have to be cowardice. And in those cases, we should not lock them out. Lastly then, on the idea that people who do not deserve to go to heaven are going to heaven anyways, I feel like there's going to be a lot of rigorous rehabilitation that exists on our side of the house, as Luigi has already characterized towards us. That is to say that your ability to go to heaven is still reliant on your ability to be a good person. Next then, on the idea of deterrence, I'm just going to weigh on why exactly are we not going to be deterring people from going to heaven in the first place. First of all, on a principle level, we've already explained that we are indebted to sinners because most of the sins done during life were because of the different circumstances. Most of the circumstances were the exact catalyst that caused you to go into hell in the first place. This means that, for example, you have to be selfish because of inequality or social narratives, and your surroundings overall impact your perception of right and wrong. That is to say that you're probably unable to go to heaven, even when you already committed these sins. This looks like, for example, if you already are working for a corrupt company but need a stable income, or for example, if you do things like have to do things without a choice, or lastly then, having small opportunities to even have rehabilitation, because there's not that many things you can do that outrule the fact that you've already done something irreversible, and very sinful in the eyes of religion that you have to reparate for. For example, if you did something, I can't think of sins. So because people will go to hell anyways on both sides of the house, and even if we do have more people going to hell on our side, we give two things. First of all, people will not be stuck in hell for a prolonged period of time, which will exist on opposition side of the house. Second off, there will ultimately be less suffering while in hell. So the people who truly do deserve to be in hell and cannot be reparated will not be suffering as much, because most of the fact that they are in hell in the first place is not exactly their fault in most cases. Lastly then, notice why it is so bad to actually be punishing these types of people, because we punish victims of circumstance who truly did not have a choice. And I think that is principally incorrect, because there truly was nothing they could do about it. And no, thank you. And why is there still going to be an incentive to be good on proposition side of the house? A few reasons then. First of all, we think that people already try to find out what is actually good and what to do to be good in the first place. This looks like, for example, how religions already indoctrinate people, or how people already learn good through being in relationships and going through their life experiences. And lastly then, people also grow old. They learn how to mature over time and learn what actually matters in life and try to understand and become a better person. And for those reasons, you're still able to do so. Last of all then, even if heaven doesn't look all that great and hell doesn't look all that bad, that doesn't mean that you want to go to hell, because the whole image of hell is not good. It looks like fiery pits in my eyes. And that is to say that thinking that is just not good, and the stigma that you think of yourself for deserving to go to hell does not make you feel like a good person in general. So you're just going to have to believe that you want to go to heaven on the comparison. It's like going to a good university and a bad university. Just because it's not that bad as a result doesn't mean that you don't want to go to the good one. Lastly then, on the idea, why is heaven still going to be ideal on our side? Firstly, we see that heaven is good because the general life you live is ultimately going to be mostly worse than heaven. This looks like for three reasons. First of all, the big example is you're able to settle down way easier in heaven because there's probably going to be a lot less struggles. This looks like, for example, you're not going to be facing all the destruction that actually exists within the world today. This looks like having climate change or a lot of politicians who are doing very violent things, and you're able to live your life without having to experience or worry about them. I'll take it later. Second off, you're probably going to be able to have an infinite life once you live in heaven. So your ability to, no matter how busy you are, your ability to follow your passions or be happy as a person is probably way more realistic because you have that infinite time. But on the comparison, if you were to live in hell, you probably don't have the opportunity to follow your passions or live properly. And notice this is very important, because just because you have an infinite life does not mean you're able to achieve anything in hell, and you're probably not being able to get out of hell because of the lack of rehabilitation programs. And that is to say, I'll take a POI.
If you say that heaven is better because you don't have to deal with politicians and climate change, yet your heaven is far less good in some way or shape or form, isn't it closer to the earth to describe to be so bad?
I'm going to extend upon this later. Lastly then, we say that I would also like to flip the idea that people don't think heaven actually looks good. Because in the info slide, it also says that you're able to see what heaven and hell looks like once you're immortal. That is to say that when you see heaven in the status quo right now on their side of the house, it mostly looks like a lot of people being bored because they have too much perfection within their life. That is to say, this means two things. First of all, not many people will probably think heaven is all that great of a place to the point where you don't want to is all that great of a place on their side of the house. Second off, people are probably going to understand to a point that the struggles that you will experience within heaven on our side is still going to be worth it to live a proper life, because you cannot live an eternal life without having any struggles, because that would ultimately strip your ability to be human. Lastly then, I'd like to point out that the whole point of religion is to actually guide people and give people hope in the first place. So this means two things. First of all, people are probably not going to be able to be guided to solace during their life. As we've given you analysis, your ability to make a lot of sins or do a lot of sins is way more likely when you're alive, especially given the small time you have and circumstances. That is to say that if you're actually going to get solace, you're probably going to have to give given the opportunity in the afterlife. Second off, the rehabilitation that does not exist on opposite side of the house gets rid of your ability to have hope. Because if you have become a bad person, you ultimately are not able to see yourself going to heaven or see yourself worthy of going to heaven in the first place, because you cannot get rehabilitation and you cannot see yourself as someone who's worthy of getting rehabilitation. Notice how this does not need to succeed during the lifetime. We're not saying that we have to have religion immediately guide you and give hope to you during your life. In the afterlife, we can still give you hope and still give you solace and still give you guidance. That is to say that even though we might have less good people during when they're mortals and during the lifetime, there's probably going to be a larger likelihood that we have more good people in the afterlife. And overall, there's going to be less suffering and just better solace in general for more people compared to opposition. And for those reasons, we're able to guide people to good.
Cool. I thank the for inviting Albert whenever you're ready.
Okay. If you have any POI, please raise your hand or stand up as long as I can get your attention. Gender pronoun she, her. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First question I would like to answer is then how then the counterfactual on government side won't be able to actually have the helpful function well, and therefore does not necessarily help the sinners. Because I would like to point out a couple of failure of the burden fulfillment done by the government, right? First is that simply to recognize that God budget is not constant and neither is it guaranteed. It's a dynamic value that constantly changes depending on the net surplus on the global good over the global bad, right? The question then becomes on whether or not the budget will actually be sustainable to uphold their principles, which rely on the practical outcome that they're actually able to provide this complex salvation towards people who do bad under their side of the house, right? Even if they're able to give onto some sort of benefits towards the whatever first generations, once they start changing this kind of a significant budget reallocation, I don't necessarily think they actually explain why then this kind of situation are actually sustainable. Insofar they don't necessarily give you the solvency onto why then people are actually going to do less bad things or why the people are actually going to do more good things under the of the house, right? It means that the second lacking of burden fulfillment here is in terms of solvency, because at best maybe they prove that people are not going to be less incentivized to go to heaven because heaven is comparatively better, or at least people they're going to get this kind of degree of salvation even if that's if they go to hell. But let's engage to their best case and assume that this is true, that maybe hell becomes less cruel whatsoever, but still they don't engage to our nuances. It is not about people less wanting to go to heaven, but it's about people shifting their tipping point by thinking about actually going to hell is not that bad, because under the side of the house there is a certainty that they're going to heaven at the end of the day. This is the difference, right? Under the side of the house, even if it's less suffering, more suffering whatsoever, it's unclear whether or not once you go to hell, whether or not you're actually able to go to heaven, because due to this kind of less resources. Under the side of the house, we're saying that these people don't deserve it, we're going to change it. Now every single person eventually, as long as they do the degree of recuperation, then they're actually able to go to heaven. Why then this is actually going to be bad, right? This is when people start justifying the things that they're actually going to do, like bad things, like in the current situation. They're saying that like I do bad things, but anyway, that's because my life is difficult, and that's exactly that they say. And maybe this is not because of choice. This is because of like birth lottery. Anyway, I'm going to condemn my bad behavior once I go to hell. This is really bad because it means they further fuel the cycles of people doing bad things, right? People that's already unprivileged saying that this is justified, stealing from other people. It means they're doing more unconsensual things from innocent people and force these innocent people to even do more crimes. This is why then, how then actually our side actually going to have better solvency? First is that we proved that at least under ourselves, the house, we already explained that boredom doesn't really matter, right? For people who are already suffering in the current situation, the status quo right now, for the mortal people, being born in heaven is really great because they literally have to work 9 to 5, suffering this kind of like situation. Even if like this kind of like there's a saturation of happiness, we see people still going to strive heaven anyway. So in terms of like striving for heaven, even at best it's going to be symmetric. But then second, it's at least people don't gamble on this kind of like certainty, right? Because they don't know whether or not they're going to heaven. They don't want to risk it because they just feel like if once I go to hell, perhaps I might actually able to I'm going to stay this for the rest of my life. It's really bad. Under ourselves, the house, they're more willing to put this kind of like gamble because they know they're going to escape at the end of the day. And thus that's why they're proving why then people are actually going to do better good. But then secondly, also they don't necessarily are actually able to sustain this kind of like heaven hell situation under ourselves, the house. Before moving on to the second point, sure.
In the most boring earthly form of life, do you agree that most individuals enjoy and endure some kind of freedom to an extent?
I don't think that's relevant to this motion. But then again, the second question here is then why then people who already do good actually deserves more of like a better heaven in comparison to like people that actually mentioned. I think the line of like defense that they're trying to put here is just like people who do bad are often, most of the time, are unconsensual. I think first, not only this is really lazy, but second, this is a huge overgeneralization, right? They're literally saying that like poor people in most situations are actually forced to do this kind of like bad things. This really disregard that a lot of like people at the end of the day, even though they suffer, they try their best, they don't want to make other people suffer, and they go to push towards like doing this kind of like moral good. These are people that ended up going to heaven at the end of the day, which they say that like they don't necessarily reserve that good of a thing, and they deserve to like get their money allocated to like other people at the end of the day. I think this is we already explained to you why then this is simply untrue like for like several reasons. First, they are the people that regardless of this kind of like temptation of the devil or like temptation of like whatever other things, they still choose to do good deeds anyway because they believe that these are the things that they're supposed to do. They have this kind of like moral upbringing. Under the rest of the house, I don't understand why then this kind of like people are either going to be compensated, but second, whether or not they're actually going to be able to generate this kind of like more people. Insofar they push for complacency, right? They're literally saying that like even if you do bad, that's literally situational based, that's like conditional, and therefore like you still deserve some sort of like opportunity to reprimand at the end of the day. Their side is the one that I will actually say God is simply unfair, because whether or not you do good or bad, people are still going to go to heaven and have like spots in a places where people actually deserve this kind of like position. But then why? The question then why then is not necessarily like important, or we say it's not principally justified to actually allocate this kind of like more budget towards like people who actually do bad. Because do note that at the end of the day, actually there is a degree of like consent, there is a degree of like autonomy that these people are actually able to choose when they want to decide it, whether they do like a certain bad things or not. But then second, do note that like a lot of things exist in a spectrum, right? They just say that like things that like people do some bad to a certain extent. I concede like probably every single one like people in this room probably do bad. I don't know if they steal, they lie, they do really bad horrible things to other people that probably consider sin at the end of the day. But anyway, it's not like the moment you do sin then you're going to hell, right? At the end there's probably a certain extent of like a metric onto where then you deserve to go to heaven and where then you deserve to go to hell. The moment you pass that metrics, it means that probably you do way far beyond that just like simple justification for like survivalship, right? Probably it means you literally actively put other people's suffering just for the sake of like your own survivalship. These are these kind of like things that they never necessarily justify under the rest of the house. I don't think God are going to put like a, you know, like a random old grandmother that just still want bread onto like hell under the rest of the house, right? That's why we already told you it's much more better to be able to protect the people who are actually deserts. But most importantly, we tell you that even if we don't necessarily solve like, you know, people who do better good, we don't make it worse. We don't make people to do bad things, and the gut budget is still going to be maintained under our side of the house. That's the best case scenario I'm proud to oppose.
Cool. I think the implementarity.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that was a good POI to ask if people can be happy in boredom. Is a perfectly normal, boring life something that people can look forward to? Technically, yes. But is that something you aspire to be? If you ask someone what their dream is, it's probably something very materially big. Something you aspire to be necessarily must be something you don't have, something you can't achieve, because that's what's the exclusivity of it. That's the grandeur of it, the glory of it, right? So then, the reason our characterization is just much more easier to buy, lower burden, is because you don't have to put yourself in their shoes to see how heaven is like. Rather, you just see heaven for what it is. You see the much more material that you don't have right now, and so it's much easier to see that as a grander place. The easy example here. If you see a man bored in a huge mansion, you would love to be in that place because it's so easy to rationalize. If I were there, I would love it so much. I would run around everywhere. I would be so happy. Doesn't matter in the long term if that's the case. Doesn't matter if that guy there is bored. So in terms of perception, and that's the delta here, I think we're taking this debate, and therefore, if the perception is why you're so inclined to want to go to heaven, you do want to go to heaven a lot more on our side, right? Think about 3 things within this debate. Firstly, on the delta of the God budget, because this is something they really have very little engagement on, right? Because it's uniquely on our side that we tell you, not only do we have the negative incentives to not want to go to hell because you'll be stuck in there forever, but also uniquely, we have a lot more positive incentives to overcome all the, let's say, hurdles in doing positive actions, right? So giving charity is hard, like I described, but the reason you would want to go up and beyond and give up your money to other people is because heaven is so nice, right? So just to avoid bad things, it's unclear why you would start doing positive things and not just not do bad things, right? And so as we provide both negative obligations and positive reasons, positive incentives to not do bad, but also to do good, that's already taking over their side, which either, by the info side, they are perpetuating a lot more harm to people in hell, but also they're giving a lot more leeway in terms of rehabilitation and therefore a lot more justification for people to do bad. But even if that's not the case, maybe they're actually deterring people. They're also not giving them any positive incentive, right? So if deterrence is largely symmetric on both sides, then you have to buy our case for giving more people a lot more incentive to do a lot more good. Therefore, in terms of overall God budget, that's probably better on our side, and therefore, that brings our hell closer to their hell. Even if it's not the same allocation, the budget itself is much bigger on our side. So that already limits the delta a lot more. Second thing then is on which people ought to be prioritized in terms of their livelihoods, right? The people of hell or people of heaven. The question here is then, how do you get to heaven or hell? We tell you that it's probably by God who knows all the circumstances, and therefore their arguments about crimes by circumstance would still might go to heaven if they really didn't mean it, right? But taking them at their best case, I guess, is one where people, what's the word? Yeah, taking at their best case, even then, most people are just very clearly people who should go to heaven or hell, right? Netanyahu should obviously go to hell. Shohei Ohtani should obviously go to heaven. So if these are, generally speaking, I think third speaker is already characterized here. Generally speaking, the people of hell probably really did bad things. And at least in comparison to the people of heaven. So either the people of hell really maybe didn't deserve to be there. The people in heaven really deserve to be there, right? They really didn't do anything bad at all. The problem then is, the people who actually consented to a punishment must then be the people of hell. They did something to then deserve that, right? Deserve a punishment. You can talk about what punishment is okay or not. At the end of the day, in contrast to the people of heaven, who did nothing to deserve this, who were the ones exploited by those same people in hell, not only is this unfair to them, that these people of hell are all just coming back up to heaven like nothing ever happened, most importantly, they're getting a decrement in their reward. So even if you want to buy their case that, oh, harm is bad and maybe there's less harm on their side, which shouldn't be the case, this ought not to come at the expense of the people in heaven, right? Because at the end of the day, a reward to them is much more morally important than a less, maybe a benefit to the people of hell, insofar as vulnerability is much different, right? So at the end of the day, the last argument is, I guess, on the extent of cruelty, right? At the end of the day, it's still unclear on their side. Do they have more cruelty and therefore more deterrence, or not more cruelty, which is against the info side? That's then true. We're winning on the first two metrics.
Well, I think do you have to click or if you can't be ready?
I'm recording again. Okay, I'm okay with this recording. The world is crumbling, and this world is hopeless. When flawed people look up at the skies, would they need to see banquets and feasts to smile? Our answer was quite simple in response and also through our POIs. It is that eternal life and salvation from suffering and some degree of freedom is enough. And in those moments, when individuals feel that they are flawed, that they have not been able to do enough good in the world, which is a reasonable enough characterization based on the way we contextualize the debate, most people feel that they are already hopeless. And so, further resources to improve hell is more likely to relieve people more, rather than the argument they wanted us to run, the deterrence argument, and stop people from doing bad things. Note that our characterization was the most reasonable in the debate. We talked about how most individuals try to do good because of social relationships, because good things breed good things, and also because they believe that they are doing a good thing based on the way they were grown up. And as a consequence, many individuals still could go to hell. So the assumption of the previous speaker and of the whip and of the DLO, when they are saying that only Netanyahus will end up in hell, is an incredibly flawed assumption. It's such a strong generalization that their case is reliant on, because to the extent that many individuals are flawed by virtue of the fact that they had limited time to make opportunities for redemption, they also are constrained by social forces around them, by their relationships, by social media, by addiction, by temptation. It doesn't have to be the fact that they do an extremely bad thing. It's the accumulation of many bad things over a longer period of time, because many things are habitual. And to the extent we said, most individuals have very difficult chances to change their circumstances to the extent, then doing good things is a relative privilege. It's the same thing they said, right? Doing a good thing like philanthropy is a privilege. Doing extraordinary, many small good things over a longer period of time is also a privilege to a certain extent. And to that degree, our argument does work. When we said we have a stronger obligation to those that are guaranteed to suffer within hell, then our argument was suffering is bad in a way that is irreversible, in a way that changes individuals, and so the decreasing of that suffering through the hope that is done through more redemptive practices within hell so that they could go to heaven is the most important change in this debate. On the other hand, how did we defend heaven? We said, and this is in my speech, I said a heaven with less luxury, more discomfort, is relatively familiar, meaning it is a world that individuals are accustomed to the degree that they enjoy living as it currently is. They want to live more. They want to live more years with their family. They want to do more work. But prison labor in hell, which is in the info side and is clearly there, the extent to which they are forced to work in prison is extraordinary. It is unfamiliar. It already deters them to some extent if deterrence was an important thing. But if not, the most important thing in this debate was most individuals are suffering in hell. And we do have an obligation to them that is stronger than individuals who are already in heaven. So again, let's be clear. And I did predict this. They can win the deterrence debate, but we win on the stronger principle, which is that most individuals, to the degree that they had limited chances to redeem themselves, to change their lives, to do better in this world, that are constrained by the forces of this world, that are already evil in and of themselves, and to the degree that most individuals operate with some degree of uncertainty on what the good is, and they struggle every day to find what that good is. They can't see it by looking at heaven and hell. They can't find what the good is only by looking at the punishments and the people who are there. They see themselves first in the lives that they currently live, and they reckon with the fact they are limited in the way that they can live in this life. And so damn, they end up in hell anyways. And that is why our most important obligation are to those individuals, which is why we win the debate.